Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, it's a deadly serious topic today. Not going to be a lot of laughs, but this is a very serious topic. And you know, whenever I think back to when I started the podcast, it's pretty easy for me to timestamp because it coincided with the tragic death of Molly Tibbetts in eastern Iowa, tragically, horrifically killed out there in broad daylight in an area of the country where you don't normally think or expect something like that to happen 3 years ago this August coming up. So I wanted to invite our friend Randy Evans in to talk about an interesting angle on the coverage that we're seeing in the Molly Tibbetts trial. And for those that may not know it, Randy Evans is the executive director of the Iowa Freedom of Information Council, a nonprofit education and advocacy organization that works on issues pertaining to open government and government accountability. Evans took over the role in October 2015 after a 40-year career with the Des Moines Register. Randy, welcome on in to a podcast by George.
Thank you, George. Glad to be with you.
And just for our readers, for our listeners around the world, I want to read up a little bit of the update. This is the reporting from yesterday out of the Des Moines Register, part of the USA Network. Let me bring this up on screen here with any luck. All right, so this reads, Behenna Rivera, two armed men put Molly Tibbetts' body in his trunk. This is by Eric Firkenhoff and William Morris. Firkenhoff, am I saying that right, Randy?
I believe so. He's part of the USA Today network. He's from out of state, though.
Okay. All right, well, let me give this a spin here. The man charged with first-degree murder in the slaying of Molly Tibbetts testified Wednesday that he didn't kill Tibbetts. Instead, he pointed blame at two unknown masked men, one armed with a gun, another with a knife, who surprised him at his home on the Yerraby Farms property in rural Poweshiek County the night Tibbetts disappeared. The men, according to Christian Behenna Rivera, forced him to get into his car July 18, 2018, and drive around near Brooklyn, Iowa, before spotting Tibbetts jogging toward town. Behenna Rivera said the men, one named Jack, made him circle around several times before stopping along a gravel road near where Tibbetts was last seen. They drove out of Tibbetts' sight. Behenna Rivera testified the man armed with the knife got out of the car for 10 to 12 minutes while the other sat in the back seat. Behenna Rivera told the jury he heard the man in the back mutter to himself while they awaited the other man's return to the car, including the phrase, "Come on, Jack." The man with a knife then returned, Behenna Rivera said, put something heavy in the trunk and told Behenna Rivera to drive them away. The men, whom he'd never seen before that night, he testified, then threatened the safety of Behenna Rivera's family if he dared to speak up, including his girlfriend and then 3-year-old daughter, and then allegedly ran off toward a gravel road. Frightened, Behenna Rivera testified through an interpreter that he went to the car's trunk, found Tibbetts, but in such a state that he couldn't save her, then carried her into a cornfield where he laid her body down. She was very heavy. I picked her up and I put her in the cornfield, he added, covering with corn stalks. I mean, some of the stuff's difficult, folks, to even think or read. I didn't want her to be too exposed to the sun. She was still clothed in running shorts and a sports bra, but when she was off, he said, I left her in the cornfield exactly as she was in the trunk. Unsure where he was or how to get home, Behenna Rivera used his phone to get directions back to the trailer where he lived at the farm. Now, Wednesday's testimony marks the first time that Behenna Rivera has publicly given a version of events from the night that Tibbetts was killed that differs from the hours-long statements he gave to police, allegedly admitting to Tibbetts' murder a month after she went missing. Okay, so let's leave that there. That's enough of that. I mean, the way that struck me, Randy, is this is one of these things that you almost have to see to believe. And fortunately, here in the state of Iowa, and I guess in most of the nation, when it comes to state and local trials, you actually can see, because cameras are allowed in the courtroom, sometimes video, sometimes still photography, but never in federal courtrooms. Kind of give us what is the rule of thumb with that?
Well, Iowa, for the last 40-some years, has allowed cameras, both still and video, to be used inside courtrooms with the permission of the judge. The media asks for the access. The judge decides. There are certain kinds of cases where it is prohibited. Cases involving juveniles, divorce, child custody, that kind of case. Excuse me. But in civil cases and criminal cases in Iowa, in the state courts, we have had basically 40 some years of history with very few hitches occurring along the way. The federal courts, on the other hand, have looked at it at various times. Senator Chuck Grassley has been one of the leading advocates in the Senate for allowing cameras into the federal courts. And I think from my vantage point, it's long overdue.
Well, I'm a big advocate, as you know, and I know you are also, of full and open disclosure in virtually everything except, troop movements in times of war. And like you said, the situation with the juveniles and the courtrooms and that type of thing. I think we're all better served if we're knowing exactly what the hell's going on. And there's no better way to know than actually seeing a video. There are some hitches, like you said, and there was in this particular trial with Tibbetts a potential hitch that kind of jumped off the front pages.
Yeah, there is the judge in the Rivera trial has allowed a 3-camera arrangement that is operated by Court TV inside the courtroom. The cameras are controlled by remote control from outside of the courtroom. The judge has allowed one still photographer and one pool reporter who gathers notes, impressions, observations, and shares it with the rest of the media. Last week, unfortunately, there was a new pool photographer who began, and this occurred on the day that they began introducing the photo evidence from the scene where Molly Tibbetts' body was found. The pool photographer decided, in consultation with her editor, apparently, to concentrate on getting sort of the emotional reaction of jurors. And Iowa's court rules are crystal clear on this, that you cannot photograph video jurors unless they're appearing sort of incidentally in the background. But this was a clear violation of the court rules, and the judge reminded the photographer that she faced the potential of jail time for contempt of court, had her destroy the photographs in his presence so they could not be shared, and then barred her from the courtroom.
Well, and then she took the extraordinary steps of destroying the photography that she'd taken right in the presence of the judge. So it was pretty clear cut that this stuff wasn't going to go anywhere, right?
Right. And the judge was reacting in response to concerns that had been voiced by at least one juror, that she was troubled that she was being photographed when the judge had told them at the beginning of the trial that they would not be photographed, even though there were these cameras in the courtroom. This is the most egregious violation of the court rules since the arrest of Chris Soules, who people may remember as TV's The Bachelor.
Yeah.
He was charged in a fatal traffic accident, and during his initial court appearance, in ignorance or disregard for the judge's directive that there were no photos or videos that would be allowed of that court proceeding, one of the journalists pulled out a smartphone and made some photographs of souls, and the journalist was charged with contempt of court, and faced the potential of jail time or a fine.
Well, and as you mentioned, the track record going back to, I remember, when I was in J school, journalism school, back in the early 70s, my professors were really excited about this. The track record overall has been very good. It's going to be difficult, obviously. The fact that everybody now has a camera on them, basically, and the Souls case is a good example of that moving forward. But I wanted to get your take on this, Randy, because I've always said, and I'm reminded of, again, this is something they taught us in journalism school, Newton Minow said that television was a vast wasteland. When I think of how the public's perception of, particularly lawyers and trials and police, doctors, and especially war, it's all been shaped to a great extent by movies, Hollywood, and television. So I think just getting this realism that you can get from cameras in the courtroom is a great thing when it comes to the nation's courtrooms, even though we don't have it on the federal level yet. I think it's a real eye-opener. And in our recent experience, you and I anyway, it was the O.J. Simpson trial. I mean, the entire nation sat down and watched that proceeding, and I think it was an eye-opener for everyone. I think it's all good, if for no other reason than to dispel the Hollywood myth when it comes to American society.
Well, I think, from my vantage point, the citizens deserve to have access to their government proceedings.
Yes.
You can watch what is occurring in the United States Congress or in the Iowa legislature. You can watch what is occurring at the Des Moines City Council meetings or at the city council meetings in Bloomfield, Iowa. Cameras in the courtroom allow the public to see for themselves how these noteworthy cases are being argued in court. I think you have a much clearer understanding of the evidence and the testimony against Derek Chauvin because of the presence of court TV cameras in the Minneapolis courtroom. I think the citizens of Iowa have a much clearer understanding of the allegations, the evidence, and the case that is being brought against Christian Behenna Rivera in the Molly Tibbetts death by virtue of being able to listen to the questions as witnesses are being asked about their interactions with Molly or their knowledge of Molly or friends of Molly's. I think it just improves the public's understanding. And that's part of the reason that it is so frustrating that the citizens are kept out of the highest court in the land, the United States Supreme Court, for example. You as a citizen, George, may not be interested in, what's going on in the federal district court in Des Moines or Cedar Rapids or Davenport this particular week, but you may have intense interest in cases that are being argued before the United States Supreme Court. You are not being afforded that access now, and I think it's just it's a travesty that the federal courts, particularly with all of the experience at the state court level with cameras, I think it's a travesty that the United States Supreme Court and the court administration is not allowing cameras into the federal courts.
Well, those opposed to those cameras in the federal courts might say, you know, we need to preserve the decorum of the federal courts, the Supreme Court in particular. We don't want that to become a reality show, certainly. I would look at it and say we need to lay that bare. We need to look at those folks. There's a couple of things about the Supreme Court that people may not realize. Number one, those are humans, folks. They do have political biases. We're coming to find that with recent reporting. And the other thing about it, I just got to say this, Randy, those dudes are old. I mean, some of those folks are really old, and there is some consideration or a movement underway that we need to do something maybe with term limits with the Supreme Court justices. Well, if you were looking at it and looking at them in real time, you would be able to get the news, obviously, but you'd also be able to kind of shape a more accurate perspective of what it really is.
Well, I think that, having seen televised coverage of some trials in other states, California being an excellent example. There's a trial going on out there now involving a wealthy businessman who's accused of murdering a close friend of his. You see a clear difference between kind of the raucous atmosphere that is permitted in the California courts versus what is generally agreed to be a highly professional judicial system in Iowa with trial lawyers who are polished, polite, poised. Those are the kinds of things that you're not going to know if you don't have opportunity to see. You mentioned the concerns about the courtroom decorum. The trial judge is the one who's maintaining the decorum in the courtroom. The presence of a camera is only going to be allowed to become an entry into a theatrical performance only if the trial judge permits it. I've met with trial judges across the state, and one of my roles is being designated by the Iowa Supreme Court to be the kind of the central coordinator of the logistics of media pools, cameras in the courtroom, in Iowa courts. The judges I've met, there's not a one of them that is not fully capable of maintaining the decorum in their courtroom. I think it's a hollow argument to talk about lawyers performing for the camera. That is not going to occur unless the judge decides to allow it. And I think the benefits far outweigh the negatives from having cameras.
Well, let me ask you something here that's very sensitive, and I don't know if you've considered this. I would imagine in your role you have, but Randy, since you and I were young journalists, this country has changed in a lot of ways, and one of the ways that it changed is this proliferation of guns. The way I put it on my podcast is not every gun owner is a nut, but every nut now owns a gun in the country. Is that an issue with these cameras in the courtrooms? In other words, if you don't have the cameras there, unless you've got a sketch artist, but a sketch is a very poor substitute for actual video, it's not as easy for people, deranged people, looking in on the internet, for instance, to see participants in a trial. And as I mentioned, they've all got guns now. They've all got lots of them. Does that play into your consideration set at all?
Well, I'm certainly concerned for our nation and concerned about the safety and well-being of trial participants. But I think because, we never really know what's going to trigger somebody to decide to solve a problem on their own, whether it's with a firearm, with a knife, or however. But I think that we should not be tempted to to take sort of cameras and news coverage out of the courtroom as a way simply to protect the participants. I think there are other ways to do that. An example, there are proposals that have been floated in the legislature to keep online access, to bar online access to home addresses of law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, for example. When I was a worker bee reporter sitting in the very same courtroom that the Molly Tibbetts case is being argued in, I would go in to cover a murder trial there, and I would have access to, from the moment the jury is seated, I would have access to, the names and the home addresses of the jurors who were sitting in the jury box. Now you would not have that. You would have access to it after the fact, but you wouldn't have access to it during the trial. Guarding against potential pressure being brought to bear by somebody with malicious motives. I think there are ways that we can protect the safety and well-being of participants without keeping the public out of the courtrooms, because we don't, as tempting as that might seem as an easy solution, I don't think we want to end up making it more difficult for people to know what's going on in the courtrooms, and for the public to be sort of kept from being able to readily to watch and view these trials as they occur. In the Rivera case, for example, the courtroom, other than the still photographer and the pool reporter, there are no other non-trial participants in that courtroom. When I was a working journalist, you could go in and you look and see in the Polk County Courthouse what trials were going on that day, and you could go in and sit down and watch. Yeah. With the COVID restrictions that are still in place, you can't do that now. There needs to be other ways to make that happen.
Well, I agree. I mean, again, I'm going to come down on the side of full and open disclosure. I think it's better for us. It's better for society. We don't get these crazy perceptions that get reinforced by Hollywood. Don't leave it up to others. The best example that I can give, going back into the Wayback Machine, is the JFK assassination. The majority of Americans get their history from movies, believe it or not. And the majority of Americans believe there was a conspiracy afoot that killed John F. Kennedy. And it's because of Oliver Stone's movie, JFK, and maybe one of the craziest conspiracy theories associated with it, that William Garrison, that DA down there in New Orleans. But just think about an entire nation, the majority of which believe that shadowy figures were at work, perhaps into the upper reaches of our own government, that assassinated an American president. So, I mean, don't leave it up to Hollywood to get your history. Get it in real time. Get it this way. I think we're all better served that way. And unfortunately, we've already run out of time. Randy, I got to thank you again, pal, for coming back on a podcast by George. We'll come back to this topic because it's a huge one. Cameras in the courtroom.
George, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Folks, that's Randy Evans. He's the executive director of the Iowa Freedom of Information Council. And if you like podcasts by George, if you like insight and information like this, I always encourage everybody to go to YouTube, watch us there, subscribe, ring the notification bell, like us on Facebook, listen to us on iTunes, the iHeartRadio app, any place where podcasts are seen or heard. But that's going to do it for this episode. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.